There are games everyone remembers. And then there are games that only certain people remember. Not because they were bad, not because they failed, but because they didn't quite fit the moment they arrived in. Flashback is one of those games. When it released in the early 1990s, the gaming landscape was loud. Arcades were full of bright colours and fast action. Consoles were pushing mascot platformers, aggressive beat-em-ups, and immediate gratification. Speed mattered. Energy mattered. Instant impact mattered. Flashback didn't rush you. It didn't shout for attention. It didn't throw you into chaos within seconds. Instead, it opened quietly. A man alone in a jungle. No lengthy explanation. No bright welcome screen promising fun. Just isolation. And that decision alone separated it from most of its peers. Flashback felt different immediately. The animation was deliberately. He reached out for ledges deliberately. He reached out for ledges with weight and intention. Every action had a slight pause, a sense of physicality. Compared to the instant responsiveness of other platform games, it felt slower. But that slowness wasn't weakness, it was mood. Flashback didn't want you to sprint through levels. It wanted you to observe them. The environments felt subdued, muted colours, industrial interiors, alien landscapes that didn't sparkle, they brooded. There was no constant upbeat soundtrack pushing you forward. Instead, silence and subtle audio cues shaped the atmosphere. That quiet design choice is part of why the game stands out in memory, because when a game is loud, it demands attention. When a game is quiet, it earns it. Flashback felt cinematic long before cinematic game became common language. The cutscenes weren't just transitions, they felt purposeful. The story unfolded in fragments. You weren't spoon-fed exposition. You were piecing together context, and that gave the game weight. At a time when many titles focused on high scores or arcade repetition, Flashback focused on narrative. It trusted the player to care. But trust is risky, because not every player wants to slow down. Not every player wants to think. And that's part of why Flashback never reached the universal fame of other 16-bit classics. It arrived in an era that celebrated speed and spectacle. It offered restraint and atmosphere instead. Combat in Flashback wasn't flashy. It wasn't about mashing buttons. You aimed carefully. You managed positioning. You used shields and weapons strategically. Encounters felt tense rather than explosive. If you rushed, you were punished. If you observed, you survived. That design choice made the game feel serious. It didn't feel like a toy. It felt like a world that operated by its own rules. And that seriousness may have worked against it commercially, because kids in the early 90s weren't always looking for subtle storytelling. They were looking for instant excitement. Flashback asked for patience. It asked for attention. It asked you to accept slower pacing. And those requests can limit audience size. But for the players who connected with it, that pacing was exactly what made it special. There's something memorable about the way Flashback handled space. Levels weren't just left-to-right obstacle courses. They felt layered. Vertical movement mattered. Positioning mattered. The world felt interconnected rather than segmented. And that design created immersion. You weren't clearing stages. You were navigating locations. It felt closer to science fiction cinema than arcade design. And that cinematic ambition deserves more recognition. Because Flashback was ahead of its time in many ways. It blended storytelling, animation, and gameplay into something cohesive. It didn't rely on licensed characters or flashy branding. It relied on mood. Mood is harder to market, but it lasts longer in memory. When people think back on Flashback, they don't always remember exact mechanics. They remember the feeling, the sense of isolation, the quiet tension, the careful movement. It felt intelligent. It respected the player. And respect sometimes gets overlooked in favor of spectacle. Flashback also existed in a strange space between genres. It wasn't a pure action game. It wasn't a puzzle game. It wasn't a traditional platformer. That hybridity made it unique. But it also made it harder to categorize. Games that fit neatly into a box are easier to sell. Flashback didn't fit neatly anywhere. And that's often the fate of innovative titles. They're appreciated later, understood more clearly with distance. Looking back now, the animation remains impressive. The rotoscoping technique gave movements realism that still stands out. The deliberate pacing now feels intentional rather than slow. The storytelling feels restrained rather than sparse. Time has been kind to Flashback because modern audiences are more accustomed to slower, narrative-driven experiences. Today, atmospheric indie titles are celebrated. Back then, they were unusual. Flashback walked so many later games could run, and yet it rarely gets mentioned in the same breath as other 16-bit icons. It deserves to. Not because it was louder or more popular, but because it was brave. It chose tone over trend. It chose atmosphere over arcade flash. It trusted players to engage rather than react. And that trust is powerful. The forgotten games are often the most interesting ones, because they weren't designed to chase popularity. They were designed with a vision. Flashback had vision, a cohesive mood, a deliberate pace, a cinematic ambition that was unusual for its time. It may not have dominated playground conversations. It may not have spawned endless sequels in the same era, but it left an imprint on those who experienced it. And sometimes that's more meaningful than universal recognition, because not every great game needs to be the loudest. Some need to be the quiet ones you discover unexpectedly, the ones that stay with you not because they overwhelmed you, but because they respected you. Flashback didn't explode onto the scene. It lingered, and even now, decades later, it feels like a reminder that not all classics are obvious. Some are subtle, some are patient, some were simply waiting for their moment of appreciation. And that's why Flashback deserves more love.
We're living for a pixel life. Game on, feeling so electrified.